I'm very pleased to be able to travel to Sri Lanka and address this meeting, as well as the meeting that we held in Kandy. It is a great honor to be able to address workers and youth in this country, and to meet with comrades who have played a long and essential role in the history of the International Committee of the Fourth International. Leaders of the Sri Lankan section are justly revered throughout the international socialist movement for their principled struggle for Trotskyism in the face often of violent opposition from the ruling class, including Comrade Kirti Balasuriam, who died 36 years ago this coming weekend, and Comrade Vijay Diaz, who passed away on July 27, 2022. It is with great pride, in fact, that all members of the Socialist Equality Party in the U.S. point to the origins of our predecessor organization, the Workers' League, and the demand for discussion on the great betrayal in Sri Lanka, of which I will speak more about later. This meeting is part of a series, as Comrade Jayasekara said, a series of meetings throughout the world marking the centenary of the Trotskyist movement, Trotskyism, the socialism of the 20th and 21st centuries. I will be discussing the significance of this anniversary, but I will be beginning my remarks with a review of the international political situation. It is a basic principle of Marxism that it is impossible to develop an orientation in any particular country based on the national peculiarities of that country, or rather beginning from these peculiarities leads to opportunist and bankrupt conclusions. We live and fight within the framework of a global capitalist system, and workers and young people confront at every point global issues. We are meeting today under conditions of an escalating series of intersecting global crises that have reached a critical mass. Two basic tendencies predominate: the tendency towards world war and political reaction, dictatorship on the one hand, and the tendency towards socialist revolution on the other. Which of these will prevail will indeed determine the fate of all of mankind. For the past 2 months, the attention of the entire world has been focused on the events in Gaza, where a war crime of truly historic proportions has been carried out by the Israeli government. A population of 2.3 million people has been systematically bombed, murdered, starved, deprived of medical care, and driven from their homes. Every day, for the past 2 months, an average of more than 130 children have been killed, far more than any war in modern history. This is just a graph on the side here of the number of people who have been killed in Gaza. 17,487 as of last count. The death toll today is now more than 17,000 since October, 70% of whom were women and children. More than 200 doctors and medics have been killed. 200, along with 130 UN employees and 77 journalists. The latest atrocity is the targeted murder of Palestinian author and educator Dr. Rafat al-Arir, who was murdered along with his entire family just a few days ago on December 6th. After a brief pause, during which the Israeli military refueled and reloaded, Israel has launched a ground invasion of the south, where the population has swelled massively over the past 8 weeks due to the influx of war refugees from the north. Not only is a genocide and war crime being carried out, but, and this is particularly crucial for workers in every country to understand, it has the full support of the Biden administration in the United States, and all the governments of the US-NATO axis. Every atrocity by Israel has been preceded and followed by statements of support from White House officials that there are no red lines, that Israel has the full support of the United States. As Israel was preparing to bomb the South this past week, Pentagon spokesman John Kirby defended the targeted killings of civilians, claiming that Israel has given Gazans, quote, a list, a map, it's outlined, a list of areas where they can go to be more safe. There's not too many modern militaries in advance of conducting operations that would actually do that. How thoughtful of Israel. They tell Palestinians where they will have to flee or risk being incinerated by bombs, provided that they can access the online list via QR code under conditions in which communication systems have been cut off and rarely work. In fact, the United States is rationalizing mass murder on the grounds that if Palestinians are in a place where they are bombed, then it must be because they refuse to follow the completely illegal orders of Israel to evacuate. Then, just this past Friday, the United States vetoed a UN resolution calling for a ceasefire. The U.S. is not only backing, but it is actively assisting in an Israeli policy aimed at driving Palestinians out of Gaza, ethnically cleansing the whole region, and killing anyone who refuses to leave. Something of a turning point has been reached. American imperialism is guilty of many crimes in its long record of war and counter-revolution. The dropping of atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Vietnam War, the destruction of Iraq and Afghanistan. But what is striking now is the openness with which homicidal violence is carried out. They do not hide their crimes. They hardly even try to lie about them. The open support for genocidal actions can only be understood as part of the unfolding global war of the US-NATO axis, which is or will impact the population of the entire world. For American imperialism, support for Israel's actions is bound up with its striving for world hegemony. Most directly, the Biden administration has utilized Israel's actions in Gaza as an opportunity to deploy massive military hardware to the Mediterranean, explicitly targeting Iran. A conflict with Iran is itself seen in relation to the U.S. conflict with both Russia and China. The war over Ukraine against Russia is now nearly 2 years old. At the time of the Russian invasion in February 2022, the Biden administration and governments throughout Europe and beyond, along with their associated media outlets, asserted that the war was unprovoked, that the response of the US and NATO powers was directed over concern over national sovereignty of Ukraine, that the US and NATO powers were defending democracy against dictatorship, even genocide. Who can now believe any of this? If the alliance of US and NATO imperialism with fascists in Ukraine did not dispel these lies, then their support for Israel's genocide in Gaza should mark the end, for all time, of any claim that American imperialism is motivated by concerns over human rights. The war was instigated by the US and NATO powers through the relentless expansion of NATO eastwards, the 2014 coup in Ukraine, and other actions directed at Russia. As for the Ukrainians, US imperialism sees them as nothing more than cannon fodder. There is, in fact, no part of the world that is not ensnared in this expanding global conflict. In particular, South Asia and the entire Indian Ocean region, including Sri Lanka. is being dragged into the US campaign to encircle China, which is seen by the American ruling class as its principal global rival. In their support for genocide in Gaza, the US and NATO imperialist powers are declaring that nothing is off the table, including the use of nuclear weapons. Perhaps even more important, the homicidal violence is a warning to the working class throughout the world. Such methods will be used to suppress all opposition to the dictates of the ruling elites in every country. Now, this war is itself part of a broader series of intersecting crises. For nearly 4 years, the entire world has experienced a global pandemic that has killed more than 20 million people due to the refusal of world governments to adopt the necessary measures to save lives, because these measures would impede on personal wealth and corporate profit. The level of social inequality now is greater than at any point in modern history. The environment is being destroyed due to the subordination of human need to private profit. The institutions of so-called bourgeois democracy are rotten through and through. This coming year will be an election year in the United States. It is being held just 3 years since the attempted fascistic coup led by Donald Trump, which had as its aim the overthrowing of the Constitution and the establishment of a dictatorship. The principal author of that attempted coup not only remains free, but he is a leading contender for the nomination of the Republican Party. Far-right and fascistic individuals are on the rise internationally, from Geert Wilders in Netherlands, Javier Milei in Argentina, Meloni in Italy, and we might add Modi in India. But the promotion of these forces is part of a universal movement to the right of the entire political establishment, which is everywhere impervious to the interests of the vast majority of the population. In the United States, it is the Biden administration that is organizing support for the genocide in Gaza and is spearheading the global eruption of imperialist violence. This is a March for Israel that was held a month or so ago. The leading figures in both the Democratic and Republican parties joining hands to declare in their chant, "No ceasefire." However, the most significant factor in the present situation is the resurgence of working class struggle. The mass demonstrations against Israel's genocide are part of this, but they come in the context of a period that has seen mass protests and strike activity throughout the world, from the largest strike wave in Britain in 40 years, to the mass protests of millions in France against pension cuts, to the protests here in Sri Lanka against IMF-backed austerity. It is particularly important for workers and young people everywhere to have a sense of the depth of the social crisis and the level of social anger within the United States. American imperialism strives the globe and asserts its interests in every country. But at home, it confronts a restive working class that can and will upend all the plans and designs of the ruling elite. Through the media and popular culture, the United States is presented as the land of unlimited opportunity. In reality, it is the most socially unequal advanced capitalist country in the world. 1 in 12 Americans don't have enough to eat. Half of the population is living paycheck to paycheck. The number of people in poverty has increased by 60% just this past year, from 25.6 million to 40.1 million. Trillions of dollars are allocated to war, while the most basic social programs are cut to the bone. More than 600,000 workers in the U.S. have participated in strikes this year, 3 times the level in 2022, and more than 4 times the level in 2021. Just a graph showing the enormous jump in strike activity in the United States just only in the first several months of this year, through August. The number of workdays lost to strikes is higher this year than at any point in several decades. This includes strikes by 60,000 film and television actors and writers, as well as the strike of auto workers. So far this year, there have been 27 separate strikes by healthcare workers against intolerable conditions. There is an enormous pent-up anger in the working class, which is striving to break free from the control of the trade union apparatus and which is doing everything it can to suppress the class struggle. Now everywhere, in every country, workers and youth are confronted with a situation that raises the need for revolutionary solutions on a global scale. We face not one or another problem in one or another country, this or that political figure. It is a universal experience. Political personalities change, but the problems remain. One person is ousted, but his successor maintains the previous policy, even escalates it. Masses of people are beginning to realize that what is at issue is the nature of the social system itself, of capitalism, as a world economic system. However, this raises fundamental political questions. What is socialism, and how is it to be accomplished? How are the forces necessary for the realization of this colossal task to be assembled and organized? Is the overthrow of capitalism even possible? The answers to these questions require an understanding of the lessons and experiences of the 20th century and the struggles that took place between political tendencies over fundamental issues of program and perspective. Struggles that had a colossal impact on the course of events. We are marking this year the 100th anniversary of the Trotskyist movement. First in the left opposition in the Soviet Union, initiated 100 years ago in 1923, and then in the Fourth International, founded 15 years later in 1938. The founding of the left opposition by Leon Trotsky, co-leader with Lenin of the Russian Revolution, marked the beginning of the most consequential political battle of the 20th century. While the initial battles with the Stalinist apparatus in the Soviet Union took place in the final months of 1923, it was in the course of 1924 that the fundamental political issues came to the fore, issues which are of immense relevance to this day. This was a conflict between Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, the theory of world socialist revolution that animated Russian Revolution itself, on the one hand, and the bureaucratic nationalist counter-revolution of the Stalinist apparatus on the other. Internationalism and nationalism. This was a fundamental issue that would reverberate throughout the 20th century. The usurpation of power by the Stalinist bureaucracy was connected fundamentally to an attack at the perspective of a world socialist revolution in favor of so-called socialism in one country, a repudiation of the most basic principles of Marxist theory. This position advanced by Stalin and Bukharin first in 1924. The impossibility of building socialism in one country had been an unquestioned premise of Marxism going back to the writings of Marx himself. Capitalism is a global system, now more than ever, and its replacement with a higher form of social organization can only take place on a world scale. In its nationalist perspective, the Stalinist apparatus was defending the privileges of a bureaucratic caste that sought to make peace with imperialism by strangling the global movement of workers for socialism. The central strategic principle that guided the struggle against Stalinism was formulated by Trotsky in his 1928 critique of the draft program of the Communist International. He said, quote, "In our epoch, which is the epoch of imperialism," and we live in this epoch today, the epoch of imperialism that is of world economy and world politics, under the hegemony of finance capital, not a single communist party can establish its program by proceeding solely or mainly from conditions and tendencies of development in its own country. The revolutionary party of the proletariat can base itself only upon an international program, corresponding to the character of the present epoch, the epoch of the highest development and collapse of capitalism. End quote. In this same document, Trotsky reviewed the central role of American imperialism. In words that speak with even greater power to the present situation, he declared, quote, "In the period of crisis, the hegemony of the United States will operate more completely, more openly, and more ruthlessly than in the period of boom. The United States will seek to overcome and extricate itself from difficulties and maladies primarily at the expense of Europe, regardless of whether this occurs in Asia, Canada, South America, Australia, or Europe itself, or whether it takes place peacefully or through war." And one might only add a caveat that a peaceful method for resolving the difficulties of American imperialism no longer exists. The Stalinist bureaucracy in its counter-revolutionary war against genuine socialism waged a campaign of mass murder, including the murder of more than 800,000 socialist workers and intellectuals in the Great Terror of 1936 and 39. As Trotsky observed in 1937, the campaign drew, quote, "between Bolshevism and Stalinism not simply a bloody line, but a whole river of blood." Trotsky himself was assassinated by an agent of the GPU, the Stalinists, on August 20th, 1940, and he died the next day. Now this battle, the battle of Trotskyism against Stalinism, the forming of the left opposition, the Fourth International, was to have profound consequences in every country, generally in the form of revolutionary movements that were betrayed, defeated, through the reactionary politics of the Stalinist communist parties, along with the Maoists, Castroists, and bourgeois nationalists. Here in Sri Lanka, the fight for Trotskyism emerged after about a decade after the formation of the left opposition. First, within the Lanka Sama Samaja Party, the LSSP, which turned to Trotskyism in the late 1930s, and then in the Bolshevik-Leninist Party of India, Ceylon, and Burma, the BLPI, formed in 1942 through a fusion of the LSSP with several organizations in India. The BLPI intervened powerfully in the anti-imperialist movement on the basis of a perspective for an all-India revolutionary struggle, uniting workers and oppressed masses of all languages, religions, and ethnicities. It won a mass audience among workers, which was a major factor in compelling the British to move quickly to reach an agreement with the bourgeois national organizations on the basis of nominal independence and bloody partition. The BLPI opposed the communal partition of India and the Constitution of Sri Lanka in 1948, the partition of India, of course, 1 year earlier, which was quickly followed by the passage of laws stripping the vast majority of Tamil-speaking plantation workers in Sri Lanka of their basic rights as citizens. The Stalinists and bourgeois nationalists, including the Congress Party, collaborated in the partition of South Asia, which led to the fratricidal slaughter and the death of more than 1 million people. At issue was the fight for the international unity of the working class against the promotion of national, linguistic, and ethnic divisions. In a speech in August 1948, BLPI leader Colombo de Silva attacked moves to disenfranchise Tamil workers, which were based on the assumption that, quote, he said that the state must be coeval with the nation and the nation with the race. He said this was, quote, an outmoded idea and an exploded philosophy. He continued to, quote, it is precisely under fascism that the nation was to be made coeval with the race, and race the governing factor in the composition of the state, end quote. This powerful denunciation of a racial definition of the state and the fight for the international unity of workers of all races, was significant not only in relationship to Sri Lanka, De Silva made these remarks only 3 months after the founding of Israel in May of 1948. The Zionist perspective that underlay the foundation of Israel was both hostile to the working class and the broad support among Jews for socialism, and was oriented to imperialism. De Silva's warning in relationship to Sri Lanka are now being realized by Israel in the fascistic genocide against the Palestinian people. Now we are marking another important anniversary this year. 70 years since the open letter, published by American Trotskyist James Buchanan, which established the programmatic basis for the International Committee of the Fourth International, which is the leadership of the socialist movement today. The open letter was written in the years following the Second World War, after the imperialist slaughter of the 2 world wars, including the Nazi Holocaust that killed 6 million Jews. American capitalism was, with the help of the Stalinists, able to organize a temporary restabilization of world capitalism. This restabilization created the conditions for various forms of national reformism, Stalinism, bourgeois nationalism, to dominate and contain the struggles of workers and oppressed masses. It also found expression within the Fourth International itself, in the form of a revisionist tendency led by Michel Pablo and Ernst Mandel, which goes by the name of Pabloism. Pabloism repudiated every fundamental programmatic principle of Trotskyism. It rejected Trotsky's insistence, stated in the opening sentence of the founding document of the Fourth International, that, quote, the world political situation as a whole is chiefly characterized by a historic crisis of the leadership of the proletariat, end quote. From this flowed an orientation to the Stalinist bureaucracy and its satellite regimes and parties throughout the world. Attributing to the state and party bureaucracies a revolutionary potential, the Pabloites sought the liquidation of the Fourth International as an independent political force. Buchanan's open letter, to which I will return, was written in opposition to this perspective and in defense of the most basic principles of the Trotskyist movement, as well as its organizational existence. Now, if the stand taken by the BLPI in 1948 represented a significant milestone, their political retreat in what was fused and renamed the LSSP set the stage for a catastrophic defeat for the working class of Sri Lanka, which would have implications not just in this country, but indeed throughout the world. The LSSP rejected Buchanan's open letter, and over the course of the next decade put Pablo's perspective of integrating into the so-called mass movements into practice. Culminated in the Great Betrayal of 1964, when, amidst a massive working class offensive for sweeping social reforms, the LSSP entered a coalition government under Sri Lankan Freedom Party Prime Minister Madam Bandaranaike. This was followed in the early 1970s by support for further attacks on the democratic rights of Tamil workers. The same individuals who had denounced the establishment of states based on race now lent their political authority to the promotion of Sinhalese chauvinism. Comrade Kirti Balasuriya, in the last statement he wrote before his untimely death in December 1987, remarked, quote, "There would never have been the fracturing of the national struggle of the Tamils and the class struggle of the Sri Lankan proletariat had it not been for the unspeakable betrayals carried out by the LSSP, sanctioned by the Pabloid revisionists over the last quarter century." The LSSP's betrayal set the stage for an explosion of Sinhalese chauvinism, while also creating confusion for many Tamil workers who had looked to the socialist-led movement, working class movement, to defend their democratic rights. It set in train the events that led to the 3 decades-long Civil War, which killed hundreds of thousands of people, and has been used to justify the wholesale gutting of the social and democratic rights of the working class, Sinhalese and Tamil alike. The Revolutionary Communist League, the RCL, predecessor of the Socialist Equality Party in Sri Lanka, was founded based on a struggle led by the International Committee of the Fourth International to draw the real lessons of the Pabloite LSSP's betrayal of the program of Socialist International. It was founded in 1968, the RCL. In the United States, the Socialist Workers' Party of James Cannon, who James Cannon was the leader of, was in the process in the 1960s, in the late 50s and early 60s, in the process of repudiating its previous struggle against populism, of which the open letter was a high point. Part of this involved the cover-up of the political crimes of the LSSP. In 1964, supporters of the International Committee within the SWP were expelled after they had issued their own open letter, demanding a discussion of the relationship between the Great Betrayal and populism. 2 years later, they founded the Workers' League, predecessor of the SEP in the United States. Now I'd like to return to the content of the open letter, written in 1953, in which Cannon concisely summarized the basic principles of the Trotskyist movement. The letter not only speaks to the situation confronting the working class, but changing what needs to be changed of our own time as well. And I'll conclude with this. Cannon said, quote, "The death agony of the capitalist system threatens the destruction of civilization through worsening depressions, world wars, and barbaric manifestations like fascism." He continued, "The development of atomic weapons today underlines the danger in the gravest possible way. The descent into the abyss," he said, "can be avoided only by replacing capitalism with a planned economy of socialism on a world scale, and thus resuming the spiral of progress opened up by capitalism in its earlier days," end quote. Now, considering these words, what is the situation that workers and youth throughout the world confront today? The US-NATO war against Russia has brought the world closer to nuclear war than at any point since the height of the Cold War, a war which would threaten the survival of the human race as a whole. The genocide in Gaza is imperialism's descent into the abyss, Cannon said. The revival of fascistic movements is the spearhead of a universal shift to the right of the entire political establishment and the turn to dictatorial and authoritarian methods of rule. The alternative to capitalist barbarism is international socialism, the reorganization of economic life on a world scale, as Brennan wrote, reiterating the basic perspective of Trotskyism and Marxism. The problems confronting workers and youth of every country are world problems, and they require international solutions. The pandemic has certainly demonstrated that there are no national solutions to the basic problems we confront. Opposition to the policies of the ruling elite is not possible within the framework of one country. Here in Sri Lanka, the events of the past 2 years have shown that regardless of the composition of the government, it is the International Monetary Fund that dictates policies. Cannon continued by stating that socialism, quote, "can be accomplished only under the leadership of the working class, as the only truly revolutionary class in society. But the working class itself faces a crisis of revolutionary leadership. Although the world relationship of social forces has never been so favorable as today for the workers to take the road to power." In the 70 years since the writing of the open letter, the international working class has grown enormously. Vast sections of the world that had previously been predominantly peasant-based have been proletarianized. For the first time in history, the majority of the world's population now lives in urban areas, including gigantic megacities with populations of 10 million or more people. The globalization of capitalist production has integrated the working class of the entire world to an extent previously unimaginable. And advances in communication have made it possible for workers in every country to coordinate their actions on a global scale. Global internet usage has increased from only 3% in 1996 to more than 65% today. The eruption of mass international protests against the genocide in Gaza has confirmed the prognosis of the International Committee of the Fourth International that the class struggle will develop as an international struggle, not only in content, but even in its form. The capitalist ruling elites have concentrated in their hands enormous, unprecedented wealth. They control governments and the media, but the international working class is the most powerful force on the planet, and it produces everything. The objective conditions create the basis for the development of a global movement of the working class for socialism. At the same time, however, as Cannon explains, workers confront a crisis of revolutionary leadership. He wrote, quote, "The main obstacle to this is Stalinism, which attracts workers through exploiting the prestige of the October 1917 revolution in Russia only as it betrays their confidence to hurl them either into the arms of social democracy, into apathy, or back into illusions in capitalism." End quote. Comrade David North, in a recent lecture in this series in London, noted that the one major change between the present and the time of Cannon's open letter is that the Soviet Union and the mass Stalinist parties no longer exist, or else they have comprehensively exposed themselves. He said, quote, "Absolutely nothing remains of the false and politically disorienting identification of Stalinism with the heritage and program of the October Revolution." End quote. Where outside of the Fourth International is there a program and perspective to lead the working class in the struggle for socialism? The Maoists, the Castorites, the various petty bourgeois national movements have been swept from the scene or been comprehensively exposed by developments as agents of the ruling class. The nationalist program did not correspond to the objective characteristics of the epoch. The crisis of revolutionary leadership, however, remains to be resolved. There is and will be no shortage of mass revolutionary upheavals. Workers are driven into struggle by objective developments. But the working class confronts internationally the treachery of the right-wing organizations that still call themselves labor or social democratic parties, the many pseudo-left and nationalist organizations, many of which in fact trace their own origins to the Pavlovite repudiation of the program of the Fourth International. In the United States, as in other countries, including here in Sri Lanka, massive anger of workers is constrained by union bureaucrats and union bureaucracies that function as nothing more than agents of management in the state. That is the fundamental issue, the crisis of revolutionary leadership. Cannon concluded his summary of the basic principles of Trotskyism by stating that, quote, "The revolutionary situations opening up on every hand as Trotsky foresaw, have only now brought full concreteness to what at one time may have appeared to be somewhat remote abstractions, not intimately bound up with the living reality of the time. The truth is that these principles now hold with increasing force, both in political analysis and in the determination of the course of practical action. This conclusion applies with even greater force to the present situation. Throughout the world, masses of workers and youth are entering into struggle and beginning to draw revolutionary conclusions. There is a growing understanding that a fundamental reorganization of society is necessary. No one believes the propaganda of the media. The bankruptcy of all political parties becomes evident, the parties of the ruling class. The task, however, facing workers in every country is the building of a genuine socialist movement in the working class that will fight to take power from the criminal oligarchs and warmongers, the purveyors of genocide and their accomplices, and reorganize social and economic life on a world scale based on social equality. In accomplishing this task, workers and youth cannot escape history. The present is formed and molded by the past, and is on the basis of the experiences of the past that we will prove up to the challenge of building a revolutionary leadership and meeting the problems of the present and creating a social society in the future. Thank you.